First of all, thank you very much for having us here. This is an opportunity to talk about something that's a little different and really hasn't been tried. So all your input and everything will be welcome because, like I say, this is new and hasn't really been tried, given a fair trial, let's put it that way. Today I'm going to talk about shared center pivots. And these, you can see, are center pivots in the Midwest. There's lots and lots of them. I doubt very much whether Africa ever looked like this, but you never know. Did I go the wrong way? I did. Okay, what motivates us to worry about irrigation in Africa? These are population projections, and you can see by 2050, the population in Africa is projected to grow by almost 50%. And while it's smaller now than many other places, the bulk of the growth will be in Africa. So definitely we have to up food production to feed African people. In addition, in Africa, you know, there's very little infrastructure. This is a map globally. And the red zones are areas that are water scarce in the absolute sense. In other words, not enough rainfall falls on them. But the yellow striped area are what they call economically water scarce. And what that means is there's not enough infrastructure to control and make the withdrawals that you need to handle water in Africa. And I ran across a statistic that really I find striking. If you look at, generally when you're talking like this, you're talking about cubic meters per year per capita. And in Africa, withdrawals are, if you look at them, they don't seem too bad at all. But if you remove the Akosombo Dam, the Aswan Dam, the Kariba Dam, and the Kaborabasa Dam, you remove half of the storage in Africa. In other words, half of the storage is in 4 megastructures. Now keep in mind, these are monstrous big dams, but still, that's an amazing statistic to me. And it shows you, it sort of emphasizes the paucity of the rest of the infrastructure. The other thing about Africa is rainfall there is extremely variable, both spatially and temporally. And the reason I like this picture, this is in a town in Ghana where we were working. And you see those head pans on that plinth where the hand pump is. That's a queue of people who are waiting to fill up their head pans. And the reason they're waiting is this is the dry season, when the water table drops and you have to wait a very long time between pumps to get that hand pump to work. At that very moment, a deluge comes down, and these women are now using their head pans as umbrellas. It's just a neat picture. I like it anyway. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, it means that given the lack of infrastructure and the variability of rainfall, you have a very zigzaggy ag development. This is a graph of rainfall superimposed on a graph of GDP growth in Ethiopia. And you can see how the growth maps according to the rainfall quite closely. Here's a similar graph for Kenya. And the reason I'm showing you two is because they're very different countries economically, and I don't have continent-wide statistics, and I just wanted to emphasize that wasn't exactly anecdotal. So it's reasonable to expect that this same pattern is extant in a lot of countries, I think. Okay, the theme of this conference, at least at one level, we're talking about blue water and green water. So you have two choices if you want to up production. You can rely on rainfall, which is what we usually call green water broadly, or you can make water withdrawals, either from groundwater or surface water sources. That implies that you're going to do two things. You're going to either increase food production by increasing the extent or size of dryland production. In other words, chop down the jungle, chop down the savanna, and commit more land to agriculture. Or you're going to try and intensify production and that is done by irrigating, because now you can control the water, you can make more investments in better seed and input, and in the best of all possible worlds, you're going to be able to grow food year-round and get higher yields in general. So what does this mean? There's often, whenever I start talking about irrigation, my ecology friends immediately start talking about ecosystem services and making inappropriate withdrawals and dams, and I understand that. I'm not belittling that point of view at all. But you have to think about how are you going to do this. If you take more land, you're destroying habitat. You have the potential for eliminating biodiversity. If you take too much water, of course, you may be denying downstream users their fair share of the water. You may be destroying fish resources. So I think that it's a matter of choice. And in IMI, where I used to work, International Water Management, there was often a debate, and people would actually sort of choose up sides. Green water is more important. No, blue water is more. To me, that's a false argument. In other words, in each country, in each region, there are reasons to intensify production, use an ample water source where your land's scarce. If there's lots of land and very little water, you may want to choose the opposite. In other words, it's horses for courses. So let's, I hope, not get into that debate. Okay, we're going to talk about an irrigation alternative. That doesn't mean that dry land production, improved seeds, and these other things are inappropriate or should be ignored. It's just we're talking about a innovation that I'd like to see tried. Now, the last one, I wanted to contrast biohomogeneity and biodiversity. Don't go to Google and look for biohomogeneity. I just made up the word because I became frustrated that there isn't a word for it. So maybe you can say you were here when you first heard it, and when it's accepted jargon globally, you know, I don't know. Maybe it'll die a quiet death. Okay, if we're going to irrigate, what are our options? Traditionally in Africa, it's been surface irrigation. When the missionaries first arrived, they would build a small dam with a little perimeter below it, trapezoidal channels, maybe 20 hectares, 15 hectares, and the local community would hopefully grow more food. Drip has also been pushed recently as a very efficient alternative. NGOs like International Development Enterprise and stuff are pushing small drip kits. They're good in a way. I have not so much confidence in them just because of the overheads and the need for clean water, and you know, that's not to say done right it might not work. So far it hasn't really been demonstrated that it's a good alternative. And then the third broad category is sprinklers. Now I put a fifth or fourth category, center pivots, which actually is just a big sophisticated sprinkler, and the reason I added a last category is because we're going to talk about center pivots. Okay, the other thing you have to think about, and there's a lot of debate about this, is scale. Again, you had these village or community systems that missionaries built. Subsequent to independence, a lot of governments poured money into small governmental systems, and eventually the burden fell on people like EFAD, GTZ, USAID. They're still building these small reservoirs. I worked on those in Ghana, and I'm a great believer in them in certain spots. They do have a lot of management issues. Some work beautifully, and then you go down the road, same biophysical environment, same people more or less, and the thing is just sitting there baking in the sun. So what are the differences? There's a lot to be studied. It's mostly within the purview of sociologists and how do we organize ourselves. In other words, the infrastructure is pretty well known and well understood, but how people use them is the critical issue. Then you've got these large schemes. Some of the biggest schemes in the world are in Africa, and Gazira in South Sudan was a huge cotton growing scheme. The Office de Niger is a very large food production scheme. Those also have a lot of issues and have been studied a lot. But the real fact is From the donor perspective and even the World Bank perspective, there's very little interest in building large schemes anymore. NEPAD and some of the African initiatives are calling for things like this, but you know, they better pay for them for themselves. When I've been in these conferences, you can just see the bankers shaking their head. Right or wrong, that seems to me the fact. Okay, so what we're proposing, like I say, is something a little bit new. In the United States, we use center pivots extensively. My colleague Rich Berkland will tell you more about them. They're basically pretty much a Nebraska innovation, at least that was the center of and they're used very widely there and very successfully. And there, we have the expectation that these things are going to give you good yields in the face of shocks, in other words, when there's drought or rainfall failure, and that these practices will have acceptable environmental impact. Now that's one of those areas where there's a lot of debate because these are associated with GMOs and the large agrochemical companies. But the real fact is that the pivot is independent of these associated technologies, okay? So I believe that shared center pivots can offer the same promise to African smallholders. Okay, like I'm trying to emphasize, a center pivot is a machine, a very effective irrigation tool. But it does not come immediately or inevitably with any other technologies, really. You can grow local varieties under a center pivot. You could grow GMOs under a center pivot. You can farm organically under a center pivot. You can use industrial farming practices under a center pivot. In other words, this is an irrigation technology that should be viewed as such. The other thing is ownership can be by the community or by smallholders, or it could be by large land grabbing firms who are busy, you know, on a mega scale. Regardless, it's for the Africans to choose what they would like to do. Okay, what's a shared center pivot? I made this definition up, and it's a very bare bones definition, and I'll tell you why. Because when I was thinking about it, I said, ownership. You know, I played with different verbs. And then I realized that even in the projects that Rich will explain and that we're considering, it hasn't been decided. In other words, this definition says a shared center pivot is a center pivot that is operated by a community of farmers for their shared benefit. In other words, they may not own the pivot, they may hold the land communally. In other words, all 100 hectares is owned, you know, together. Maybe they have smallholder plots under them. In other words, all those sort of details, which are absolutely critical to the success of the center pivot, and which may be different in different places, I didn't want to put in the definition. So you get this very simple definition, and there's nothing official about it. I mean, I just wanted to explain, you know, my view on what was going on. Okay, here is a pivot, and this is courtesy of Valmont Industries. And the reason I'm showing you is just to explain what a span is. The span is the tool between the two sets of wheels. And the way you make a pivot larger or smaller is by adding or subtracting spans. These are extremely versatile. You can have them, you know, very big or much smaller. Okay, and this is the critical graph that explains why a shared center pivot makes sense. You have the cost per hectare as a function of the size of the irrigated area. And if you'll notice, right around 40, 45 hectares, when you move from 45 out to 110, there's very little difference. In other words, essentially, there's no change. But at smaller diameter, smaller total hectarage, the cost per hectare becomes enormous and prohibitive. And that's why you cannot manufacture, or that reflects the fact that you can't manufacture small pivots for individual farmers. These pivots only work on a relatively large scale, and if people don't hold large holdings, that implies that they have to be shared as an asset. Okay, what are the advantages? Lower capital costs. In northern Ghana, a small dam with an irrigated perimeter of 15 to 25 hectares can cost anywhere from $300,000 to $500,000. A center pivot of much larger, that maybe 100 acres, could cost around $250,000 installed. So it's cheaper. You have a much lower impact on the landscape. You're not damming a stream, even an ephemeral stream. You're not moving earth. You're not leveling the land. A center pivot, you're installing a supply, either a well or a piped source from a river or a lake. The pivot itself is just on wheels. It runs over the terrain as is. I was not an expert, and I'm still not an expert on center pivots, but one of the most surprising things I learned when I moved to Nebraska was how steep center pivots, they can go up a 15% slope. I mean, I always thought they were relatively flat. Partially, I think, because you look out of the airplane and it looks flat, But these things, you don't have to level the land. So they, like I say, they make a much lighter footprint. You have controlled water delivery. You can put the water on with extreme precision, exactly when you want it and how you want it. And this is extremely important. One of the problems with irrigation, surface irrigation schemes at any scale, community all the way up to these huge systems in Pakistan, is equity of delivery. Head enders always take all the water they want, or at least try to. Tail enders are often sitting there going, my crop is dead because there's no water coming down the canal. There's been fights. I've heard stories in Pakistan where they were debating whether to open or shut a gate. And a friend of mine went with an irrigation authority out to this place, and there's a tree. There's 40 guys, all with AK-47s, that wanted that gate either open or shut, I don't know. And he said the guy that he was with, they saw him in the distance. He goes, uh-oh, turned around. They didn't even go to the meeting. The guy just said, I'm out of here, and turned around and went home. So these disputes are serious, okay? Equity in these schemes is a big issue because of conflict, but also it's a big issue because of production, because one end is growing something, but the other half are not. The nice thing about a pivot, as it spins around, if it's operating properly, it delivers the water just like you want it. If you want it equitably delivered, if this guy wants more or less, you have the ultimate control. In other words, there's no head end, no tail end. Resilience. Say you get in a drought, or there's some water diversion upstream, or for some reason your supply no longer exists. Well, you can actually just pluck the pivot off the ground, pack it on a tractor trailer, and move it. Okay? I mean, you can't do that with a small reservoir. You can, in terms of you can increase deliveries, decrease deliveries, they're extremely resilient. And the other thing is the potential for multiple use. If on that scale you've made a commitment to deliver water to that pivot, it's very simple to add a few more feet of pipe and supply domestic or use. The amount of water that a household will use, or even that cattle will drink, is trivial compared to the amount of water you're delivering to the crops. So that marginal cost of oversizing your system a little bit is relatively small. And I would urge you do it anyway, because water is water, and if people don't have something to drink, they'll find a way of getting water out of your pivot. Okay. Then the other thing that's important, and this is an issue that we've been tackling on the formulation of this project that Rich will describe. There's all kinds of externalities, things beyond the direct control of the community, that are important to the success of the pivot. They have to have reliable market access. In other words, they have to have transport, if necessary, cold stores. They have to be able to market their product. They have to have good market information. They have to know what people in the capital or Europe or wherever they're selling their food want and what the prices are, so they can make intelligent decisions about the crop selection, what they grow when. They need reliable supply chains. You've made a commitment to a big piece of equipment that has considerable recurrent costs associated with it. You better be able to get good seeds, good fertilizers, whatever the inputs you choose to use on time and in the proper quantities. And you have to worry about a sustainably managed water resource. If you're just putting one pivot somewhere, this is probably a relatively minor issue. But if this were a successful model and it were replicated, you have to start thinking on the watershed or basin scale. What does it mean to have all these pivots on land that was previously maybe rain-fed or maybe even just cattle producing rangeland? In other words, it implies a certain level of collaboration and management. In Nebraska, everybody talks about the High Plains aquifer being drained and this and that, and that's true in the South. Nebraskans manage their end of the aquifer quite well. And it's very funny, when I first got there, I would sit in these meetings, quite high-level meetings, about the management of the aquifer. And these guys, they're very polite, and they think they're fighting viciously. And then I'm walking out thinking, man, this is smooth as can be. And it really is. It's quite, they have this system called NRDs. It works very well. Anyway, my real point is, in Africa or in anywhere else, if you get adoption rates that are significant, you're going to have to worry about managing the resource. Okay. Now, this is really, for me, the sticking point. Up to now, it's like, hey, do it. Everything's perfect. But the ability of the farmers to organize themselves under the pivot is essential. It will determine the success or failure of this idea. And there's a lot involved. There's the governance. Is it a company? Is it a community committee? You know, how do you organize, how do you create the institution that will work under this pivot? Finances are critical. Even the finances for the maintenance of a hand pump in a village become an issue. If somebody thinks that somebody's stealing the money and this and that, it has to be transparent. The farmers have to be sufficiently sophisticated that they can look at a balance sheet or an accounting and be convinced that they're not being cheated. Ownership. Who owns the land? Is it held in common under the pivot as if it were one farm? Is it individual plots under the farm? What shape are they? Is the land on this side of the pivot better than the land over there? Why was Billy given a good plot and I was given an inferior plot? All these issues are critical. People have to cooperate and they have to be satisfied. Who owned the land before? In northern Ghana with these irrigation small dams, some of them didn't function at all simply because GIDA, the Ghana Irrigation Development Authority, came in more or less by executive fiat and said, we're going to do this and that. But they built the dam right on top of somebody's farm. And that guy was never satisfied, and he was a relatively powerful figure in the village, so the thing will sit there. So these land tenure issues, converting from the old tenure system, whatever it is, to the new one, doing it properly, equitably, and in a way that everybody agrees is also important. Labor or participation. Now you have a very sophisticated machine roaming around. What if I decide to heck with it? I'm going to go to town and be a diesel mechanic, and I'm not farming my plot, and furthermore, I'm not going to pay for the operation of the pivot. In other words, who's in, who's out, maintaining a consistent sort of cropping pattern is important. And none of these things are easy, and I don't have an answer. Like I say, we haven't tried this yet. Not we, me, but we, the world, hasn't tried this. These are things that people are going to have to consider. And then, of course, marketing. How do you sell things? Do you sell it collaboratively to get the best price? Is everybody on their own? What precisely are you doing? These are all things that will be different, probably in different locations, but their importance is, in my opinion, undeniable. Okay, why is this important? I just found this quote and I kind of liked it. He who feeds you controls you. Where is imperialism? Look at your plates when you eat these imported grains of rice, corn, millet. That's imperialism. And this is a quote from Thomas Sankara. He was the president of Burkina Faso when they changed the name from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, and he was murdered, and the present president, Campawari, who was a friend of good old Thomas, actually killed him. Anyway, he was an African patriot and one of those leaders that I think should be considered along with Nyerere and Mandela and stuff. But I like that quote. In other words, these guys got to grow their own food so they can be free. That's it.